When people ask me why I never remarried, I usually say something short like, didn't work out the first time. That's enough to change the subject. Nobody wants the real story, because the real story makes people uncomfortable. I was 28 when I proposed to Sarah. We'd been dating for 3 years, living together for 2. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. That's what I loved most about her. She had this quiet warmth that felt like home after a long day. I worked in logistics, just got promoted to director of operations at my father's company. Not sexy, but solid. I wasn't rich, but I was doing fine. My dad, Charles Maddox, was rich. The kind of rich that fills a room before he walks in. Old money, flashy watches, dark suits in August. Owned 3 companies, sat on local boards, bought silence with dinners and golf memberships. We didn't have a bad relationship, but we weren't close. He was one of those figure-it-out-yourself types, except when I did, he'd take the credit. Sarah never seemed interested in his world. When we first started dating, I remember her meeting my dad at some charity thing. He barely looked at her. She said afterward, "He reminds me of the men who tip well, but never say thank you." I laughed for 2 days. Anyway, I proposed on her birthday. Small dinner at this place in Midtown she loved. Gave her a simple ring I'd been paying off for months. She cried, said yes, hugged me so tight I almost dropped the wine. 2 months later, she was gone. I came home from work to find half the apartment empty. Closet open, drawers pulled out. The note on the counter was one line. "I'm sorry. I have to follow what feels right." That's it. No call. No face-to-face. 3 years together, evaporated in 10 words. At first, I thought maybe she had a breakdown. Or maybe she was in danger. I called, texted, even went to her sister's place. Nothing. Silence. Then, 2 weeks later, the news broke. There was a photo in the Valley Courier. My dad, Charles Maddox, 61 at the time, with his arm around Sarah at some fundraiser gala. She was wearing a red dress I'd never seen before, and a ring that wasn't the one I gave her. They weren't just dating. The article described her as his fiancée. I read that sentence 3 times before I even understood what it meant. Fiancée, as in engaged. To him. My first instinct was disbelief. Then denial. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she was a +1, and the reporter got it wrong. But no. The next week, they were on the cover of Westlife magazine. Charles Maddox finds love again. Her smile was bright. His hand was on her waist. The quote under the headline, "Sometimes happiness comes when you least expect it." I didn't leave my apartment for 4 days. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends. Not my mother. Not even my younger brother, who lived across town. I couldn't bring myself to say the words, "My father stole my fiancée." That kind of thing doesn't even sound real. It sounds like something out of a soap opera. At work, my father acted like nothing happened. He didn't call me into his office. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge it. I would pass him in the hallway, and he'd nod like we were just co-workers. I became invisible to him, a smudge on a white shirt. But everyone else knew. You could feel it. The way people stopped talking when I walked into the break room. The way emails came less often. Meetings got moved without telling me. Projects handed off to others. My authority, what little I had, vanished overnight. Not officially, of course. On paper, I was still director of ops. But in every real sense, I'd been cut out. And then came the final blow. A month after the engagement photos, I got called into HR. My position was being dissolved, they said. Corporate restructuring. Downsizing. Nothing personal. But it was personal. I asked who made the call. The head of HR gave me a tight smile and said, "This came from above." Which, of course, meant my father. So just to recap, I lost my fiancée to my own dad, got humiliated in the press, and then fired from the company I helped build, all within about 9 weeks. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and realize everyone's been laughing about you? That's what my life became. No matter where I went, there was this whisper in the air. Isn't that the guy whose dad stole his girl? People love that kind of gossip. It makes them feel better about their own lives. I moved out of the apartment, sold what I could, put the rest in storage. Stayed with a buddy in Tacoma for a few months while I figured out what to do. Sarah never reached out. Not once. There was no apology, no explanation, no closure. Just one day she was mine, and the next, she belonged to a man 3 decades older, who also happened to be my father. I wish I could say I got angry, that I screamed or broke something. But the truth is, I didn't do anything. I just disappeared. No one saw me for a long, long time. After I left Tacoma, I didn't tell anyone I was back in the city. No announcements, no reconnecting with old friends, no attempt to explain where I'd been or why. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the west side, paid 6 months up front in cash, and kept to myself. I didn't go to bars, didn't join any clubs, didn't post anything online. I got a gym membership that I barely used, and spent most of my time reading, taking notes, and thinking about everything I had ignored for years because I thought I was already on a path. The silence was strange at first, but eventually it felt clean, like standing in an empty room after someone else moved out. I got used to the space between things. I registered a business under a name no one would recognize. I used my middle name and my mother's maiden name, which had been buried behind my father's shadow long before I was born. The company did basic supply chain consulting at first, small businesses, outdated systems, a lot of shipping mistakes, and inefficient storage setups. Most of my early clients didn't even know what logistics meant until I showed them how much money they were losing. I built trust by solving problems they didn't even know they had. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it kept my mind focused. Nobody cared who I used to be. Nobody asked me where I came from or what I had walked away from. They just wanted the job done right and done quietly. That was fine with me. In the first year, I worked out of coffee shops and library rooms. By the second year, I had a small office with one part-time assistant. By the third, we had real contracts with manufacturers that needed their entire fulfillment systems overhauled. I stayed under the radar. No interviews, no photos, no press releases. The company didn't even have my name on the website. I let the results speak for themselves, and the referrals kept coming. The clients didn't care if I was charming or charismatic. They cared that I delivered what I promised. That was all I needed. Occasionally, I would hear my father's name come up in conversations, usually from vendors or logistics partners who had worked with Maddox Holdings. They'd mention how big the company was, how tight the contracts were, how structured and formal the relationships had become. They never brought up Sarah by name, but I knew she had taken over some of the public-facing duties, probably acting like she had grown into the role. I didn't ask questions. I nodded politely, changed the subject, and went back to work. There was no point in showing interest. The less people knew about my connection, the better. Once, a supplier asked if I'd ever met Charles Maddox. I looked him in the eye and said, "I've heard of him." That was enough. Nobody pressed further. Most people in this industry don't care about family drama unless it affects payment terms. And I made sure mine never did. At some point, I stopped checking their names online. In the early days, I used to keep track of every event they attended, every article written about them, every new board seat or business venture they took on together. But over time, it stopped making a difference. Their life became noise, and I had other things to build. I didn't need to follow them to know what they were doing. I already understood how they operated. It wasn't complicated. She married into power. He married a younger version of his own ambition. They didn't care how it looked because they believed no one would question it. Maybe they were right. At least for a while. From a distance, they probably looked like a successful couple running a well-known empire. I didn't care what it looked like anymore. I was too busy making sure they never saw what was coming. But to anyone watching me, I didn't seem like someone with a plan. I kept my head down, delivered good work, paid my employees well, and declined every invitation that involved a camera or a stage. When clients asked why we didn't expand faster, I told them we were focused on stability. When recruiters offered to buy out my business or merge, I told them we weren't interested. I wasn't chasing scale. I was building reach, quietly. It was different. Greg called a few times a year. We met for dinner every now and then, and he always brought up Sarah, usually in a sideways kind of way, like asking if I'd heard about some gala or fundraiser or whether I'd seen the billboard outside the Civic Center. I always said no. He'd give me a look like he didn't believe me, but he didn't push. He knew I wasn't the same person he helped get through those first few months in Tacoma. I appreciated that he didn't ask for details. Most people would have. "Are you happy?" He asked me once over drinks. I didn't answer right away. Eventually, I said, "I'm not trying to be happy. I'm trying to be effective." He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. I didn't date. I didn't explain. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking about late at night when the city got quiet and my mind started running back over old conversations, little things Sarah had said in the weeks before she left, moments I hadn't noticed for what they were. She had already made her decision. I had just been too close to see it. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast and then burns out. What I felt was slower and more useful. It was the kind of feeling that made you plan your moves 2 years in advance and keep going even when nobody else saw what you were doing. It was the kind of feeling that didn't need to be shared. I never mentioned them by name. I never brought up what happened. I never tried to defend myself or correct the narrative that had been written without me. Most people assumed I had just taken a different path. Some figured I got out of the game early, cashed out, moved on. Nobody suspected I was still playing. That was exactly what I wanted. All I had to do was wait. It started with a missed delivery. Nothing dramatic. Just one of Maddox's manufacturing clients complaining that a shipment arrived 2 days late without explanation. Then it happened again the following month. A different client, same complaint. The suppliers blamed the freight company. The freight company blamed Maddox's outdated system, and Maddox sent a quiet apology and waived a fee. They thought that would be the end of it, but I knew it wouldn't be. I had seen this exact problem develop in other firms that refused to update their back-end systems. Eventually, the margin of error starts expanding until the delays stop being occasional and start being predictable. And predictable problems become reputation issues. I wasn't behind those first few issues. Not directly. Those were just the natural consequences of a system running too hot and too old. Maddox Holdings had grown too fast and assumed the name would carry them through operational inefficiencies. And for a while it did. But when clients started getting better service elsewhere, faster fulfillment, clearer tracking, lower breakage, they noticed. A few of them began asking questions, nothing aggressive, just light inquiries about how things were changing and whether the firm had brought in any new partners recently. Word travels fast in logistics. Even faster when the people at the top don't realize how much they rely on the ones beneath them. By the time one of their longtime suppliers quietly ended their contract and moved over to a newer, leaner firm, I could feel the first real signs of discomfort coming from that side of the industry. Maddox wasn't bleeding, but they were leaking. And not one person from their executive office seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't say anything publicly. That was how it always was with my father. He believed the worst thing you could do in business was admit a weakness out loud. He thought silence projected strength. But silence just isolates you from the information you need. One day, I ran into a former Maddox employee at a regional supply conference in Denver. We had both ended up at the same presentation on AI inventory forecasting. During the break, she approached me and said she used to work under my old department. I didn't let on that I remembered her right away, but I did. She had been smart, always quiet in meetings, but sharp when she spoke up. We talked for 10 minutes. She told me she had left 6 months ago because the company had become top-heavy and difficult to navigate. When I asked her what she meant, she said decisions were being made by people who didn't understand the consequences, and no one down the chain felt comfortable speaking up anymore. Before she walked away, she added, "I always wondered why you left so suddenly. You were one of the good ones." I just smiled and said, "I had somewhere else to be." She didn't push. A month later, another Maddox partner pulled out of a joint warehousing deal. I heard about it through a contact who worked at the regional carrier that serviced both of us. He said Maddox was scrambling to find alternative storage, and they were running out of options. Then the gossip started. It wasn't loud, not yet. But at trade shows and vendor lunches, people started whispering about how Maddox Holdings seemed less stable than before. Their pricing was higher, their schedules harder to pin down, their account managers slower to respond. One supplier said they were trying to renegotiate a long-standing contract at a loss, which was unheard of. Someone else mentioned that 2 of their lower-tier partners had begun approaching competitors behind their back, offering inside data for better rates. Nothing was confirmed, of course, just whispers. I never joined in. When someone brought it up to me directly, I played it off like I didn't follow that part of the industry anymore. It wasn't hard. I had built a reputation for being focused and private, so people didn't think twice about my disinterest. But inside, I tracked every shift, every personnel change, every sudden opening in the market that looked like an accident. I didn't have to engineer every failure. All I had to do was make sure I was ready when the gaps opened. One morning, I got a call from a client we had recently on board. They told me that a Maddox representative had tried to undercut our rates by offering a full year of service at a loss, something that would have made sense 5 years ago when they had the resources to eat the margin. But now, it just looked desperate. The client asked me if they should be worried. I told them no. that companies make bold moves sometimes, and that we'd continue doing what we promised. They renewed with us that afternoon for another 2 years. That's when I knew for sure that the panic had started. Not a big, public kind of panic, but the quiet kind that eats away at confidence from the inside. The kind that spreads from one meeting room to another, where people stop making eye contact in elevators and board members start calling each other privately instead of scheduling group calls. Maddox had always relied on image to cover its flaws, and now that the image was showing strain, the foundation underneath it began to creak. Sarah hadn't been visible for a few months. I checked. Her name wasn't on any event rosters, and her face hadn't shown up in the usual donor newsletters. I knew she liked being seen, so her absence meant something. Maybe she had stepped back. Maybe they were keeping her out of the line of fire. Or maybe, for the first time, she was realizing that the security she chose wasn't as permanent as she thought. At night, I reviewed the progress. Not like someone admiring a painting, but like someone checking a ledger. No rush. No celebration. Just confirmation that things were moving the way they were supposed to. A few more shifts, and the structure would start to break in ways they couldn't patch. The board would notice. Investors would ask questions. Clients would hesitate. And then the story would start changing. All I had to do was stay quiet. The first public sign came in the form of a financial filing. Maddox Holdings had delayed their quarterly report by 2 weeks, which didn't go unnoticed by the small group of analysts who still paid attention to logistics companies. The delay wasn't explained, but anyone who understood the timing knew it meant they were either scrambling to correct something or trying to stall until they could spin it properly. A few business sites speculated about restructuring. One blog claimed their CFO had quietly stepped down in the previous month. There was no formal announcement, which meant they didn't want attention drawn to it. That was how they handled anything that didn't benefit the image. If it couldn't be marketed, they buried it. A week later, 2 of their smaller regional clients terminated their contracts and went with newer firms, both of which were connected to vendors that had once worked with Maddox but had since shifted loyalty. These weren't headline deals, but they were the kind of relationships Maddox had always counted on to hold their network together. Losing them wasn't just a financial hit. It was a signal that the old guarantees were no longer reliable. People don't leave unless they feel something is already falling apart. The company responded with a new round of marketing campaigns, pushing a rebrand focused on modernization and adaptability. They pushed out a statement about investing in cutting-edge software and hiring a new logistics director from out of state. The press release described him as a bold innovator with a record of transformation, though no one who read the industry pages believed it. He came from a small firm that had folded the year before. They were trying to create confidence using recycled language. But by then, the image was already shifting. Clients weren't reading headlines anymore. They were reading contracts, and many of them were trying to renegotiate. Then the layoffs started. Not huge, not front-page numbers, but significant enough that word spread fast. Several employees from Maddox's third-party distribution wing were let go with vague explanations. Most of them had been there for years. One of them posted about it online, tagging the company and calling the decision disgraceful. It got picked up and shared around the industry, especially among junior workers who already suspected that upper management had no plan. A few people replied with their own stories about recent budget cuts and unreturned emails. The company stayed silent. They always did when something couldn't be explained in one sentence. I received an unsolicited email from a warehouse manager who had worked with Maddox for 6 years. He didn't know who I was or how deep my connection to them went, only that I now ran a company with a reputation for reliability. He said he was exploring options and wanted to know if we had any interest in acquiring new fulfillment space in the Midwest. His message was short, but the meaning was clear. Maddox had pulled out of their agreement without warning, and he didn't want to go down with them. 2 weeks later, their largest packaging supplier began requiring prepayment instead of 30-day terms. That was not standard for a company of that size unless there was a problem with credit or payment history. Industry people noticed. Calls were made. Rumors turned to assumptions. The market didn't collapse, but it flinched. I saw a photo online of Charles at some luncheon for regional business leaders. He looked older than he had in the past few years, and not in the usual way. It was in his posture. The smile was still there, but it didn't hold as long as it used to. He wasn't standing at the center of the group like he always had. He was off to the right, half-turned, like he had just stepped back and didn't want to draw attention. Sarah wasn't with him. Her name hadn't shown up in anything for months. A friend of mine who worked in commercial leasing told me they had quietly canceled plans to expand their office space downtown. The new build-out had been scheduled for late fall, with signed agreements and preliminary contractors already assigned. It had been in the works for over a year. Now the space was back on the market. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. People began asking each other questions they wouldn't have considered 6 months ago. Were they over-leveraged? Was someone hiding losses? Had they lied about partnerships that never materialized? The narrative that had once sounded like strategy now sounded like desperation. And with every quiet withdrawal, every silence where a response should have been, the story rewrote itself. A local paper ran a small investigative piece titled, "What Happened to Maddox Holdings?" It wasn't an attack, just a cautious outline of the decline in performance and visibility. They reached out for comment, but no one responded. The article wasn't shared widely, but the people who needed to see it saw it. Board members, stakeholders, former employees. The ones who used to defend the company stopped replying to messages. The ones who had kept their doubts private began speaking more freely. I didn't celebrate. I didn't talk about it to anyone. Greg tried to bring it up once at dinner, asking if I'd seen the article. I just shook my head and said I hadn't read the news lately. He looked at me for a while, then changed the subject. I could tell he didn't believe me, but he also knew better than to press. There was no single collapse, no headline that spelled out what went wrong. It wasn't that kind of failure. It was the slow kind, the kind that comes when people stop believing what they're told and start acting on what they see. Their silence, once seen as control, now looked like avoidance. Their image, once polished, now looked filtered. The things they had built on reputation began to fall under their own weight. And through all of it, I didn't say a word. I never cared about destroying the company. That wasn't the point. What I wanted was much simpler. I wanted them to understand that every step they took toward comfort, every decision made out of pride or greed or fear, had a cost they never bothered to calculate. I didn't need to fight them. I only needed to keep building while they kept pretending. It took years, but eventually the gap between reality and performance grew wide enough for everyone to see. The reputation they protected became the exact thing that betrayed them. I gave it time, and I made sure I was standing just far enough away that no one thought to trace it back to me. There were no tricks, no crimes, no illegal sabotage. Every move I made was above board, and every deal I closed was done through someone else's eagerness to escape Maddox Holdings. The partners who left them did so because they were offered better service, better technology, and better terms. Things Maddox couldn't compete with because they were too concerned with legacy and appearances. The vendors who chose my firm did so because they were tired of not being listened to. I didn't need to convince anyone. I just had to make myself available at the right time. That's what they never understood. It wasn't personal for anyone else. It was just business. The only personal part was the reason I started in the first place. The moment it shifted from rumor to certainty came quietly. I was at a supply chain forum in Dallas, sitting on a panel about automation. A man I'd never met introduced himself afterward and asked if I had any interest in expanding into asset recovery. I told him it wasn't something we handled directly, and he nodded, then paused like he was considering something. He lowered his voice and said, "Maddox Holdings is bleeding. Everyone knows it now. I just didn't expect it to happen this fast." I didn't say anything. I just waited until he moved on. He had no idea who I was. 2 weeks later, I received a formal acquisition proposal from a private group that wanted to invest in my company. The offer was generous, but what caught my attention was the language they used in the letter. They described us as the leading alternative to legacy firms like Maddox. They weren't just buying growth. They were buying the position Maddox used to have. That was when I knew the shift was complete. My name wasn't on the offer. It was addressed to the company itself. My identity didn't matter to them, only my results. Just like I wanted. I didn't accept the offer. I didn't need the money. Instead, I took a short trip back to the neighborhood where it all started. The Maddox name was still on the building, but the front desk had a new face. The receptionist didn't recognize me, which meant the turnover had reached all the way to the ground floor. I asked if Sarah was in the office. She looked at the calendar, then said she was out indefinitely. No explanation. I thanked her and left. That same afternoon, I sent 2 letters. One went to Charles, the other one to Sarah. Both were handwritten, short, and direct. No accusations, no anger, no summary of what they did. Just a sentence they would understand in their own way. The same for each of them. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth the cost. I didn't sign them. I don't know if they ever read them. I didn't need to know. What mattered was that by the time those letters arrived, the town already had its own story. People were talking. They weren't asking whether something had gone wrong at Maddox. They were asking how it had gone so wrong, so quickly. And every time someone tried to explain it, the same question came up again and again. Wasn't it strange how things started falling apart not long after Charles married someone his son was once engaged to? That was always the part they couldn't make sense of. No one ever had proof. But in a town like ours, stories don't need proof to live. They just need enough silence to grow inside. The version they told each other was simple. The son disappeared. The father took what wasn't his. Then things started to go bad. Maybe it was business. Maybe it was karma. Maybe it was something else. That was the version people repeated. And the more they repeated it, the more they believed it. I was never mentioned by name. That was the part one liked most. I became the blank space in the story. The question people didn't know how to ask. It stayed that way, even as Maddox Holdings was removed from the board of regional supply associations. Even as more vendors quietly dropped their contracts. Even as Charles stopped showing up to the events he used to dominate. Even as Sarah's name was taken off the leadership roster without explanation. I stayed in the background, exactly where I had been from the start. No one saw the lines connecting what I built to what they lost. That was the whole point. There was never going to be a speech or a confrontation or a final scene. Just a slow rearrangement of power and perception. I didn't take anything from them. I just made sure no one wanted to give them anything anymore. Greg asked me once if I ever thought about reaching out to her, just to say something. I told him no. He asked why not. I said, there's nothing to say. He nodded. He didn't bring it up again. The company kept growing. I kept my name off the website. I hired people who didn't care about the past. I didn't talk about it, and they didn't ask. Every once in a while, someone new would mention the Maddox collapse as a cautionary tale, and I'd just listen. I had no interest in correcting them. They already understood enough.